Greetings all, this is Rick Levine with your forecast for September 2021. And before we get to the actual material, I have just one announcement and then something to say on the way into the material. So I just would like to remind, especially those of you who live in the Northeast section, Northeast corner of the United States, that I will be participating in a special weekend conference called Astrology, Consciousness, and the Great Shift. And this will be held at the Omega Institute in the Hudson Valley, just north of New York City. And there'll be a handful of us, including Maurice Fernandez, Kay Taylor, Ann Orderly, Catherine Andren. We will be doing a deep dive into astrology and the astrology of these times and some very interesting topics. If you want more information about this, go to the Omega Institute website, and I'll see many of you there in person, not in a Zoom room. Okay, that's number one. Number two, I had the distinct pleasure of joining my friends Chris Brennan and Austin Coppock on the Astrology podcast in order to break down the astrology of this month ahead of September of 2021. We went well over 2 hours, and for those of you who want to totally nerd out and geek on down, I suggest that you go listen to this. It's not just one person, that would be me, blabbing away, which I will do in just a moment anyhow. But we have some pretty interesting discussions about the astrology of the month ahead. And that link is down below here, and I'll also put it in the description so you can click on it there. But I suggest that you, or I encourage you to look at the September 2021 astrology forecast on Chris Brennan's astrology podcast website. And for those of you who know Chris's work, you know how detailed and scholarly and accurate his work is. It was a pleasure being a guest on that show. And I encourage you all to take a look at his Patreon pages, because you can support his excellent work there also. And while we're on the subject of Patreon, of course, I always want to mention how much I appreciate those of you who subscribe to whatever level of you do on my Patreon account. It is your subscriptions that enable me to devote the amount of time and effort into not only this podcast or this webcast, YouTube video, but also the daily Planet Pulse that appears on Instagram and on Facebook. And of course, the interviews, of which I have several right now that have been recorded. And so you'll see some of those for those of you who are at the planetary tier and higher. You will see some of those appearing in the days ahead also. So thank you all for all of you who do participate in that. And for those of you who don't or don't even know what we're talking about, you can check out my subscription videos at patreon.com/Rick Levine. And with no further ado, let's look at the astrology of the coming month. You know, September is an intriguing month because it's hard to put. Normally I put like a phrase or a word around it, around each month. And September is difficult because there's a lot going on. But again, like August, there's not a lot of outer planet movement. You know, the outer planets now are pretty much all retrograde. Jupiter, starting with Jupiter and Saturn and Uranus and Chiron and Neptune and Pluto are all retrograde and remain retrograde all month. And so, although it might feel like we're moving into new territory and we're moving ahead, I always describe this, it's like standing in the ocean at the beach, and maybe up to your knees, and you can feel the power of the waves coming up against you, and you can tell the tide is coming in, because each wave coming in, or every few waves, is coming a little bit higher on your legs. It's a little bit, deeper. And then at the same time, though, you can feel the undertow pulling the energy way down deep out. And so astrology is a bit like that, in as much as we have rhythms within rhythms within rhythms, which create their own waves, their own swirls, their own eddies. And the fact that Jupiter, Saturn, Chiron, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto are all moving retrograde, it's like the heavyweights are, that's like the tide is I don't know which way it's going, but the tide is going one way, where the Mercury, Venus, and Mars, the faster moving personal planets, are all moving quickly the other way. And so it may be a bit confusing, because we can't quite figure out how things are going, whether we're really making any progress or not, although on the surface it seems like it. Now, what happens this month is that Mercury does turn retrograde. Mercury turns retrograde on the 26th of the month. And obviously that is, the very end of the month. Mercury will be retrograde from September 26th through October 18th. But there's an impact that we're going to be feeling all month. You see, Mercury moved into Libra on August 29th. And Mercury has been moving through each sign in about 2.5, 3 weeks, 2 weeks or so, because the end of July, Mercury had moved into Leo. And then mid-August, it moved into Virgo. And by the end of August, it had moved into Libra. So in 1 month, Mercury had basically moved through 2 complete signs. So it's moving about 2 weeks through each sign. However, Mercury moved into Libra on August 29, and it doesn't move into Scorpio until November 5th. That means that Mercury stays in Libra for 2 months, actually just over 2 months, 2 months and a week. And this is because it's retrograde motion. So why that's important is that Mercury is already moving a bit slower. It's slowing down. And Mercury, although it turns retrograde the end of September, it actually, by September 6th, early on in the month, Mercury reaches 10 degrees of Libra. The reason why that's significant is that in mid-October, after spending 3 weeks retrograde, Mercury will back all the way up to 10 degrees of Libra, and it'll turn direct on October 18th at 10 degrees of Libra. What that means is that from September 6th, when Mercury reaches that 10-degree Libra point, all the way until it turns direct again at 10 degrees of Libra on October 18th, that whole period of time, Mercury will be going over territory twice in the same. It'll move forward through that territory, and then it'll retrograde back through that territory. It turns direct on October 18th, and it's not until November 2nd that Mercury actually moves through the latter point in that. That would be 25 degrees of Libra, which is where Mercury turns retrograde on the 26th. And so what happens is that Mercury is in this area we call the shadow. And the shadow is that area where a retrograde planet goes through direct, and then it comes back retrogrades, and then it goes through direct again a third and final time. And so we have this month setting up a longer term scenario. And in particular, when Mercury makes this direct retrograde, direct trip through its shadow area, it'll often make aspects to the slower moving planets 3 times. And in fact, Mercury does that. Mercury makes a quincunx an awkward, irritating quincunx to Uranus on November 10th, and a quincunx to Neptune on November 17th. And then Mercury, when it turns retrograde, not until October, but it's then going to make a quincunx a second time to Neptune early October, and then a second quincunx to Uranus mid-October. And then once it turns direct, it's going to make a third quincunx to Uranus toward the end of October, and with Neptune toward the end of October. So what this means is that the irritations, the annoyances, the uncertainties that we may be feeling around November 10th, give or take a few days, and the 17th, while Mercury is making those quincunxes, that's not just a one-time shot. We need to make little notes or put markers in our Outlook or whatever calendaring system we use, because these are things that will come back again. Now, the upside is that on September 20, Mercury makes a trine to Jupiter. And this is big ideas, big thinking. This is optimism. This is uplifting. And once Mercury turns retrograde on October 3rd, it'll make that trine, Mercury will make that trine to Jupiter a second time. And in fact, once it turns direct on Halloween, on October 31st, Mercury will make a third and final trine to Jupiter. And so this whole period, even though we may go through many different scenarios in the middle of it, it's kind of bound by this big thinking, optimistic hope that there's something good going to happen in the future. The last thing that I want to talk about this Mercury retrograde is that it will also make 3 squares to Pluto. The first square it makes to Pluto is on September 22nd. The second one is on October 1st. We'll be feeling that around its station already around around September 26th. In that period of time, we'll be feeling Mercury already coming into that second square to Pluto, and then the third one not until mid-November. But this Mercury square Pluto is about secret hidden information that's been buried, that comes to light, that it's almost like we're dredging the sludge out of a bottom of a stagnant canal or something, and we bring up stuff, and as we bring it up, it reveals things that either we didn't know and now we know it and we can't unknow it, and we have to integrate it, we have to incorporate it, or things that we were absolutely sure we knew, things come up and can change our perspective. So this Mercury square Pluto is very significant. And for that reason, even though Mercury doesn't turn retrograde until the end of the month and then stays retrograde through the middle of October, through October 18th, it's going to be impacting us all month. And again, retrogrades are not necessarily bad. What they are is the planet that's retrograde, in this case Mercury, gains more power as it moves slower, and it's sometimes more difficult to express, because when a planet's more powerful, the energy just doesn't fit in naturally. It becomes so much that sometimes we then want to hide it or bury it. And I think this is an important piece of this dance that we have of Mercury trining Jupiter and squaring Pluto. The trining Jupiter is, it's okay, and the squaring Pluto is, yeah, but here's what comes along with it. So that's the story of the Mercury retrograde. Let's jump in and look at some charts. So here we are looking at a chart for September 1st, 2021. And charts will be for noon Pacific Daylight Time, unless otherwise noted. And that means that we are using an Aries rising wheel, which means there is no ascendant or midheaven. However, at 12 noon Pacific Daylight Time, if you adjust for your time zone, wherever you are on the planet, the moon will be, in fact, at 6 degrees Cancer and 49 minutes. So this way we can actually look at a chart, that is good anywhere in the world, but we do not have the houses to rely on. We're just looking at the planets and their signs and their relationships to one another. For those of you who happen to be here new, I just want to say very briefly, I'm using solar fire, and I have it set up so that as planets get very close to being exact in any particular orb, the line gets very thick, which allows us to see those aspects as they perfect, as they get exact rather easily. For example, here we can see that Mars at 21 degrees 30 minutes Virgo is almost a half a degree orb, a little bit slightly more to Neptune at 22 degrees Pisces and 8 minutes. And compare that, for example, to the Sun at 9.5 degrees Virgo, trining Uranus at 14, almost 15 degrees of Taurus. And that orb is about it's about 6 degrees. It's about 5 degrees. And so that line is very thin. Now, remember, just because a line is thin doesn't mean it's inoperative, but it certainly is not as immediate for that day as is the ones with thicker lines. One last thing before we get into the specifics is that red is used for oppositions and squares. Blue is used for trines and sextiles. Green is used for quincunxes and semisextiles. And orange is used for half squares, semisquares, and squares and a half, or sesquisquares or sesquiquadrates. And those are the aspects mostly that we'll be looking at. We might look at a couple other aspects at a very specific chart for one reason or another. So looking at the chart for September 1st, noon on September 1st, there's a couple of things that stand out right away for me. The first thing is something I already mentioned, and that is that Mars is opposing Neptune, and it's close, but it's not exact until tomorrow. And when I say yesterday, today, or tomorrow, I'm referring to the date of the chart. I'm recording this on the evening of August 31st. But if I say today, because this chart is for September 1st, that's what I'm referring to as the date of the chart. So when we look at this chart, it's important to note that the exact, or the perfected, Mars-Neptune opposition is tomorrow, is September 2nd, and we'll look at the September 2nd chart in just a moment, but it's already close enough to be creating energy, to be having some impact. And what is the impact of a Mars opposing Neptune? Well, Mars is directional, and in Virgo, Mars is a bit cautious or timid. It wants to make sure that it's moving in the right direction. It needs to know that it has all of the data, it's taken its bearings, and it needs to know that it's going correctly before it actually goes anywhere. And yet Mars opposing Neptune makes it very difficult for Mars to know where it's going, because Neptune fuzzes things out. And so we may have a little bit of loss of momentum, or a sense of uncertainty that becomes significant, maybe even crippling, to the point that we don't know what to do. There's so much where we have lists, we know exactly what we want to do, but we can't start because we're not sure as to where to jump in or what to do first. Prioritizing things can be difficult. So that Mars opposing Neptune is building today, September 1st, tomorrow, and even for the next day or so. But it's also important to remember that Mars opposing Neptune can be tremendously creative and inspirational, and even spiritual, as long as we don't try to get somewhere. If we try to get somewhere, we can end up being frustrated. But if we just keep a perspective on the fact that it's okay to not being directed towards completing a specific goal, then that Mars opposing Neptune can be magnificent as it comes through with creative ideas or music or poetry. Or this may be a time in which we want to catch up on what binge watching something that's fantasy oriented, or maybe just spending some time outside in nature and watching clouds, doing things that maybe don't have a specific productive goal tied to it. The other thing that's actually exact today, September 1st, is the sun forming a square and a half to Pluto. And this is a bit anxiety producing. It's almost like if we can't figure out exactly where to go and what to do, we get nervous or worried about it, but there's no immediate resolution. So we have this bit of a dilemma at the beginning of the month of not quite knowing where we're going or how we're going to get there. By September 2nd, we can see that the Mars and the Neptune are even closer. To being exact, at noon, they're just 1/30th of a degree, 2 minutes of arc from being exact. And then as we move to the 3rd, we can see that that Venus forms a quincunx. Venus forms a quincunx with Neptune, and that's exact later in the day. Here it shows Venus at 21:49, 21 degrees Libra, 49 minutes, and Neptune at 22:05, but they're already very close. And this quincunx with Venus and Neptune might be a lack of certainty over how much emotion or need or vulnerability perhaps to express. We might feel a little softened with someone, but we're not sure that it's appropriate for us to actually say how we feel, and so there's a little bit of uncertainty there. On the 3rd, also, the sun is forming a quincunx with Chiron. So we have two quincunxes going. And if you remember from last month, we talked about what I call last month was like driving down Quincunx Alley. Quincunxes are irritating. They're annoying. We can't resolve them. In fact, all the green lines, both the quincunxes and the semisextiles, of which we can see a bunch of in this chart, they can be a bit frustrating because we can't resolve them. And I think a lot of the annoyance of August, which I think I referred to as the noise, is that there's not a lot that we can do with it. And we have some of that carrying over toward the beginning of September, where the sun's quincunx to Chiron, I'm sorry. The sun's quincunx to Chiron is also this kind of inability to know how vulnerable to be. Chiron has to do with our wounds and our hurts, and it also has to do with what we're able to teach others. What we're able to teach others often has to do with what we learned the hard way. And so even that can be tied to vulnerability. But the fact is that September 3rd, I think, is a bit of it's a difficult day because there's just so much going on that isn't easily resolved. The good news is that we're already on the 3rd picking up on a Mercury trine Saturn that is exact on the 4th, but we're already picking it up, and you can see that Mercury trine Saturn is kind of hiding in the background here, but it's a little thin blue line that as we move one more day, it becomes thicker. It's buried by the quincunx, the green line and the orange line, but it's underneath there, and it's there. In fact, I'll draw it in a little bit heavier on the actual video itself. It's not showing that intense here. But Mercury trining Saturn gives us some stability in communication. Both what we say and what we hear is more reliable than it has been. In other words, if you learn a truth, if you find information, if someone tells you things today, it's it's more reliable, it's potentially more useful than something that you maybe heard yesterday or the day before. Or maybe today on September 4th, we just get the corroboration that what we thought we knew is actually true. I think that this is a very supportive aspect. I like it. By the time we get to the 5th, we have Venus forming a square with Pluto. And again, you can see that here already, it's coming in. But by the 5th, that is a much thicker line. And here we have on the 5th and 6th, and moving into the 6th is a new moon. You can see here that the moon is still in Leo, but the moon will move into Virgo, and the exact new moon is at 5:51 p.m. tomorrow on the 6th. We'll have that chart up in just a moment. But here on the 5th, we have Venus forming an exact square with Pluto. And Venus-Pluto square is deep feelings can come up, but they're not necessarily comfortable. Remember when I was talking about the Mercury retrograde, I talked about Mercury being retrograde, and one of the aspects it makes 3 times is it's square to Pluto at the end of the month, November. I'm sorry, I keep saying November for September. On September 22nd, October 1st, and then November 12th. Well, Mercury square Pluto is intellectual. It's deep things that we think or that we know. It's facts that come up from the deep. The Venus square Pluto is about feelings, but they're not necessarily easy to integrate. And so this can be difficult to work with, but it also can be the juice that can create more intimacy and more closeness in a relationship if we're willing to actually be vulnerable and not have all the answers. Now, as we move to the 6th, we now get that Mars, which is now partile, actually perfected in its trine to Pluto. This takes the pressure off the Venus square Pluto. And now that physical energy, Mars is working with that deep and powerful, intense Pluto. I like this day a lot. And in fact, I like the new moon on this day. Let me move this ahead just a little bit. We're looking at September 6th, and the new moon itself is at 5:51 p.m. And now we have the chart for 5:51 p.m. on September 6th showing, and we can see that we have that new moon in Virgo, and that new moon in Virgo. I think this is a fantastic new moon. It's not without its annoyance or difficulty. I mean, look, there's never a perfect good or a absolutely bad set of energies or difficult. But the new moon on September 6th at 14 degrees of Virgo is partile. Remember, partile just means it's at the same degree. So it's at 14 degrees and 14 degrees, 1438, 1438 for the sun and the moon. And Uranus is at 1440. So this trine between the new moon and Uranus is really tight. It's 2 minutes of orb, meaning it's 1/30th of a degree. And this is about change. This is about something breaking free from the past, something breaking through. This is about blockages that all of a sudden they're flowing. And I don't think this means that all of a sudden everything will be perfect. And the reason is because we also have Mars making an exact quincunx with Jupiter. And so it's almost like too much becomes not good, because that Mars-Jupiter can be overinflated. Jupiter is expansive, it's magnifying, and Mars is fiery and feisty. And although it can be a bit timid in Virgo, that Jupiter encourages it, and Mars comes on too much. And it might be too much. It might be too much, especially with the new moon trining Uranus, because that also, it can be sudden and explosive. And I say explosive, I don't necessarily mean war explosive. It can be metaphysically, spiritually explosive, awakening. And on the same, at the same time, Mars is not only creating a quincunx with Jupiter, but it's also creating that trine with Pluto. And so we have some really deep and powerful energy. And what's totally interesting here is a pattern that I'm going to show you, because I'm just fascinated with this pattern. Now we're looking at the identical chart that we were looking at before. This is still the chart for 5:51 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. And this is a chart for the Virgo New Moon, the time to plant those seeds of intention that are very exacting and very detailed, that we're planting seeds of that are useful, because Virgo is an earth sign. However, we have this intriguing pattern where Mars and Jupiter are quincunx. Mars is trine Pluto and Venus is trine Jupiter, and Venus is square Pluto. When you put all this together, you also have Jupiter forming a half of a sextile, a semisextile to Pluto, and Mars forming a half of a sextile, actually Venus forming half of a sextile to Mars, a semisextile to Mars. The Huber school is a school of astrology that has really dug deep onto many, many different patterns. And they call this pattern a trampoline, which is kind of interesting, because you can kind of almost think of the green quincunx between Jupiter and Mars being the base, and that red line on top, you could almost jump on it and it would have some spring to it. The fact of the matter is that this is very difficult on the outside. If you look at the outside of this configuration, you see a square, a semisextile, a quincunx, and a semisextile. These are all aspects of either annoyance, irritation, stress, conflict. They're not easy. But on the inside, there's tremendous flow and even adaptability. And so I think that this little pattern that is separate from the new moon's trine to Uranus, and you can see that when we add that trine between the sun, moon, new moon, and Uranus, we see more blue, we see more easy flowing energy. And so I think we got a day of amazing change that can be very transformative, but we have to be careful about overdoing it. That Saturn is not part of this configuration, and yet it's really important to recognize that some restraint, some self-restraint will help make these changes last even longer. By the 7th, the day after the new moon, Mercury has moved into an opposition with Chiron. Communication here becomes incredibly important, especially if we have the courage to address those things which, again, bring up vulnerabilities, but without blame. With an opposition, it's easy to project one side onto someone else. When I say one side of the opposition, the Mercury side or the Chiron side. And yet the real gift of an opposition is to internalize both the Mercury and Libra, seeking fair balance, seeking a place where we can create harmony. That's Mercury in Libra, seeking a place where we can be diplomatic and work with both sides of the equation. This is seeing clouds from both sides now. And then Chiron in Aries is that part of us which is either more forcefully vulnerable. How does that work? Well, that means coming on with our vulnerabilities, our weaknesses, our fears, maybe inappropriately, pushing that energy a bit too hard. Chiron in Aries is also about the instantaneous awareness that comes when we actually have a healing. And with Mercury opposing Chiron, there is the potential for healing, and more so potentially in relationship if, and here's the caveat, if we don't go into that oppositional mode of trying to blame someone for how we're feeling, or blaming something in the past for what's going on now. That Mercury opposing Chiron has to be self-contained or self-aware and in the present moment. Moving on, that Mercury then moves from its opposition to Chiron by the 10th. It moves to a quincunx with Uranus. And again, we're just getting these repeating patterns of all these planets on the Virgo, Libra, Scorpio side of the chart compared to the planets on the Capricorn, Aquarius, Pisces, Aries, Taurus side of the chart. And these planets are moving in and out of sesquisquares, quincunxes, trines, oppositions, making a lot of aspects, making a lot of noise again, like August. But remember, these outer planets on this side of the chart are not going anywhere fast. In fact, they're going so slowly, they're going backwards. On the 10th, we also have Venus moving from Libra into Scorpio. Now, Venus was at home in Libra. She liked being in Libra, and she's not as happy as being in Scorpio. And what's going to happen here over the next few days is that on the 10th, Venus moves into Scorpio. And on the 14th, we'll get there in just a moment, Mars moves into Libra. And what this is Venus moving into Mars's sign. Remember, you moderners who associate Pluto with Scorpio, that traditionally Mars is associated with Scorpio. So Scorpio is a home sign for Mars, as is Aries. So we have Venus moving into Mars's sign. And on the 14th, we have Mars moving into Libra, which is Venus's sign. And so these two planets are both not in places where they like to be. In fact, they're both opposite places where they would prefer to be. Venus prefers to be in Taurus, and opposite that, she's in Scorpio. That's in her detriment. And Mars prefers to be in Aries. Well, that's at home in Aries. And so Mars is in his, Venus is in her fall in Scorpio, and Mars opposite its home sign is in its detriment in Libra. And yet these two planets are in each other's signs. So it's like I always think of they're like at a card game. They're at a poker table, and they're not sitting next to each other, but there's like let's say there's 5 people at the table and there's someone sitting between them. Somehow they're passing cards under the table. That because these two planets are technically once Mars gets into Libra, they are in mutual reception. When the chart catches up to what I'm talking about, I'll touch base on this again very briefly and just make sure you get what I'm saying. On the 13th, we have Mars making a square and a half with Uranus. Remember, I say the planets keep going in and out of opposition, trine, square and a half, sesquisquare, quincunx. And now we have on the 13th, we have Mars making an exact square and a half to Uranus. This is unsettling. This is, again, this is disruptive energy that is out of whack with what's going on. I don't like this this moment here, because this combined with the Sun opposition to Neptune, which is not exact until the 14th. Here it shows 21 and 21, but it's exact early in the morning on the 14th. And so there's stuff going on here that's not, it's not what appears to be going on. And so this combined with that Mars Uranus can be the release of some stress or tension that that isn't necessarily easy. And I think that this is even made more complicated by the fact that Mars right now at the last degree of Virgo is kind of feeling like it needs to get stuff done before it leaves Virgo, before it heads into Venus land in Libra. And Mars is not as impactful in Libra because it's would rather give peace a chance than to fight it out. And yet by the 14th, we have the sun exactly here. Again, here it shows slightly after, but this occurred in the morning, the sun opposing Neptune. And this is confusion in relationships and not understanding what's going on. On the other hand, there's this kind of like idealism that can create situations where we believe that we can be whatever we want to be, or we believe that someone else is in fact whatever whatever we want that person to be. The other thing here that's building is that the sun is making a half square, and a half square with Venus. That's a thin line yet, and a square and a half with Saturn. And Neptune is making a half square with Saturn and a square and a half with Venus. And again, we have another form of like that trampoline. Let me get this up all by itself so that you can see this clearly. So here we can see the symmetry of this pattern, which is kind of like that trampoline that we looked at earlier, but this isn't as nice. Why? Because there's no easy on the inside. Instead of having crisscrossing trines on the inside, we have crisscrossing sesquisquares. And this is difficult inside and out. In fact, this is no fun at all, and this persists for a couple of days. But remember, it's the Sun opposition Neptune, that not seeing things as they are. The Anais Nin line that she wrote, we don't see things as they are, we see them as we are. And this is a good example of what's going on here, except with Saturn and Venus involved, we can have that kind of reality check that may not necessarily be fun. By the 16th, we have the sun now forming a trine with Pluto. And this is a little bit nicer, easier. To say any aspect with Pluto is nice is kind of not necessarily the best way to phrase it. In my chart, I have the sun trine Pluto. It's not that it's nice, but it's something you can lean on. It's something you can depend on. It allows, or maybe doesn't even allow, it forces one to go deeper, whether they want to or not. And so I think we have here on September 16th, a day of actually going deeper, and yet we may not want to. Why? Because we have Venus squaring Saturn, and in fact the moon is moving right through that aspect on the 16th. And so this is not fun. This is like, yes, we're going deeper, yes, it's working, yes, there's stuff happening, and at the same time we might feel like it's not worth it, like we're isolated or isolating. It's difficult. It's there's a sense of feeling alienated or alone here as Venus makes that square to Saturn on the 16th. We have some more quincunxes on the 17th and 20th. Mercury makes a quincunx with Neptune. You can see that already happening here. It's a thin line. There's Mercury's quincunx with Neptune on the 17th. Again, communication is fuzzy. It's not right. It's almost like the more we say, the less people understand us. And then by the 20th, we have Venus making a quincunx with Chiron. You can see that here is also a really thin line, but we go on a couple of days, and there's the Venus Chiron. And again here, it's it just, something doesn't feel exactly right. Things are a little bit out of whack, and yet coming into this at the same time, and it's buried here. It's almost like when there's difficult aspects, there's often easier aspects to make things work. And that is that Mercury is forming a trine with Jupiter. That Mercury trine Jupiter is also one of those aspects that will repeat 3 times that I talked about in the opening here. The first time is today, September 20. It repeats on October 3rd, which really means, because Mercury stations in less than a week, and Mercury makes its station very, very close degree-wise. Mercury's station is at 25.5 degrees. And so it's really within a couple of degrees of where it is right now. And so through this whole time, from September 20th, really all the way through the first week of October, that Mercury is going to be trining Jupiter, which is positive, optimistic, expansive. This is good. This is things seem to be on the up and up. And yet at the same time, that Mercury is also moving in and out and around that square to Pluto. We talked about that earlier on, and now we're actually getting to see that as Mercury makes this trine to Jupiter, it will in a day make that square to Pluto. And so here we are on the 20th. Also on the 20th, the sun is still in Virgo, but that sun is getting ready to move from Virgo into Libra. And we also have on the 20th the full moon, which happened just a couple of hours before noon. Let's see, it's actually no, it actually happens at 4:54 p.m. So here at 4:54 p.m. on September 20th, we have the moon at 28 degrees of Pisces, 14 minutes, the sun at 28 degrees Virgo, 14 minutes. And now we have that juxtaposition between narrow perfection, the finite, narrow casting, specificity of Virgo, and the moon kind of reflecting the fuzziness, the lyrical poetry and spirituality and imagination of Pisces. And I don't think this full moon is as nice as the new moon was. It's not that it's terrible. Remember, we do have Mercury making that exact trine with Jupiter that we talked about a little bit earlier, but Mercury is also squaring Pluto. So stuff's coming up that we don't want to talk about, even though we might ultimately turn it into something good and be uplifting with that energy. We have that Venus quincunx to Chiron. Again, it's annoying, but look here at the Sun, Venus, Moon, Uranus. Once again, we have another symmetrical pattern, and this is not a trapezoid like those trampolines. This kind of looks like a mystic rectangle. In a mystic rectangle, you'd have a sextile, then a trine, a sextile, and then a trine. So here we have a sextile that's been narrowed into a half square. Remember, a sextile 60 degrees. That 60 degrees has been squeezed down to 45 degrees so that we have Sun, Venus at a half square, and then Venus and the moon are a square and a half. And then the moon to Uranus is a half square again, and Uranus back to the sun is a square and a half with 2 oppositions in there. Venus is still a few days away from it being exactly opposed Uranus. Actually, it's on the 23rd that's exact. But this full moon has this energy of kind of like wanting something that's not what we have. The Venus opposition to Uranus is the breaking out, the desires that are not socially acceptable. Those things, it's almost like being drawn towards something really new, really innovative, really eccentric, non-conventional, and that may be great, but it may be too much again. So we have now this thing cooking around the full moon. Let me go back and put the rest of the aspects in and move this back to noon. one other thing I want to say before we move on, and I said I would bring this up again once Mars had moved into Libra, and then it moved into Libra, and I didn't say anything. It actually moved into Libra on the 14th. But once Mars is in Libra and Venus is in Scorpio, remember, Mars in Libra looks to Venus to do its work. This Venus is the dispositor. Mars in Libra looks to Venus because Venus rules Libra, and that Venus is in Scorpio, and Venus looks to Mars to do her work, its work, because Venus is in Scorpio and Mars rules Scorpio. And then this Venus and Mars are in mutual reception because each of them are receiving each other's energies. Whether or not there's an aspect between them at this point doesn't matter. So bringing this up now past the full moon on the 20th, we also have on the 22nd is when Mercury makes that square to Pluto. We talked about that a little bit before, and that's the first of those three squares. And then later on the 22nd, the Sun moves from Virgo into Libra. This is the spring equinox in the southern hemisphere, the autumn equinox in the northern hemisphere, where I am. But you can see here at noon, the sun is at 29 degrees Virgo and 59 minutes. The equinox actually occurs 21 minutes later at 12:21 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. That's when the sun moves into Libra, beginning the new season, beginning the new half of year, if you will, because this is the equinox when the days and nights are equal all over the earth. And it's very, very close to and exact the following day when Venus makes that opposition to Uranus. And again, that's the attraction to those things that are new and different. But at the same time, we have another piece building, and that is that Mars is coming into a trine with Saturn. You can see it here already beginning to build. It's a couple degrees away. That blue line is not very thick, but as we move this closer to the 23rd, we can see that line grow in thickness until Mars is perfected and exactly trine to Saturn. This is organization. This is fantastic for being able to manage a complex project, for being able to put things together in a way that has a flow, even though there may be many, many discrete parts. Mars is physical energy, it's work, it's going somewhere, and Saturn is the structure. And so here we have this trine in air sign, so it may work intellectually or mentally. I note that, interestingly enough, this is the weekend when we'll be doing the astrology conference at the Omega Institute in Rhinebeck, New York. And this is a magical time for that kind of work to occur. It's almost like astrologers picked the date. All right. So on the 25th, we have that Mars is trining Saturn. Incidentally, the sun will come up and trine Saturn behind Mars. That does that on the 29th, but it reinforces that energy. These last days of September are fantastic for making things that endure, for starting projects that have lasting value. But there's something else occurring in here, and that is that Mercury is grinding to a halt. Now, remember, we looked at Mercury back a few days ago when it was squaring Pluto back on the 22nd. And Mercury is at 24.5 degrees of Libra on the 22nd. So now we go to the 24th, even the 25th, and Mercury hasn't even moved a degree in 3 days. And by the 26th, that Mercury has stationed, it's still at 25 degrees. And so now it is technically retrograde on the 26th, late on the 26th. But on the 27th, it's still at 25 degrees. And in fact, On the 28th, it's still at 25 degrees. And now it'll gain a little bit more speed moving backwards, but it's still on the 29th. It's still at 25 degrees. And now it's at 24 3/4 degrees on September 30th. And now it's back to 24 and something degrees on October 1st. Okay, so we have Mercury turning retrograde on the 26th. I'm going to talk a lot more about Mercury retrograde in the October forecast, but let it suffice to say that when Mercury goes retrograde, we may get frustrated if we think things are going to be moving forward at the same pace. This is a time to basically pull in energy, to redo things, to kind of focus on what's before you or in front of you without necessarily trying to push ahead, because otherwise we get frustrated. We have on the 27th, we have the Mars square and a half to Jupiter. I'd mentioned that earlier also. And that's about overdoing, and it's kind of like the ability to push things too hard, too fast, too far, especially with Mercury turning retrograde. Then we get to the 29th. And on the 29th, we have a couple of very important aspects, but this is a sweeter energy. The energy is kind of, it's working here. We have the sun forming that trine with Saturn. Remember, Mars had trine Saturn just a few days ago on the 25th. And this is that organizational energy that works. This is really doing things in a practical manner. And we also have Venus forming a trine with Neptune. And this is dreams that work. I mean, this is kind of a sweet day. It's almost like we can get things done, and at the same time, we can live off in our fantasy realms or in our dream time. The sun makes that square and a half to Jupiter on the 30th. The sun makes the square and a half to Jupiter. There that is. We also have Mars coming into an opposition with Chiron. It's technically not exact until tomorrow, October 1st. But this is, again, we're running into something here that needs fixing, needs healing. We have something to learn or something to teach. And I think, though, that these last few days of the month, oh, and we also have Venus forming a square with Jupiter, which, although it's a square, if you're going to have a square, okay, we have Mercury squaring Pluto. That can be tough because it's difficult communication. Venus squaring Jupiter can be stressful, but the stress is basically I'm having too much fun. It's or I'm overindulging. There's a sense here with Venus squaring Jupiter that we need to be a bit cautious, that we don't push something too far, that we don't overindulge, because we'll pay a price if we overextend borders or overextend boundaries. That's it. That brings us to the end of the month. Let me unshare my screen. And let me just say a few words before closing. The complicated thing about September is that there's a lot of motion, yet not a lot of substance. There's not a lot that happens. It's almost like we're transitioning. It feels like we're moving forward, but we're not moving forward as fast as we think. And at the same time, there's something else building that's building momentum, but it's not building it forward. It's building it by what's not being said, by what's bubbling under the surface. There's stuff going on that will come out later on. And October, November, and December, I think, get pretty difficult. There's stuff, all that stuff that's bubbling now, that's not expressing fully. I think by the third and final exact Saturn square Uranus, which occurs on Christmas Eve on December 23rd, that we'll see some of the stuff come to a head. And yet I think that it will build through November and on through December. But I think it's important to keep in mind that we need to still be careful about getting swept up in any extreme thinking. This is the danger of 2021 as a whole. This is the danger of Saturn square Uranus. Saturn is an immovable object. Saturn is a wall. Saturn is a structure that you can't break. Uranus is the energy that breaks unbreakable structures. Uranus is an irrepressible energy. You can't hold Uranus back. And yet Saturn is containing it by this dynamic square, by this stress. It's almost like if you start a nuclear reaction, once it starts, or if lightning starts to strike, it can't stop once it starts. And so that's what we're in the middle of. We're in the middle of playing this through, and no one knows where it's going to go. Even those people who know, they know where it's going to go. No one knows. And what that means is we need to be careful about falling into any extreme thinking on any issue, because things will resolve in a way we're not aware of yet. And so it's important to remain, or at least not to remain flexible, but to strive toward flexibility. Even if we think we know, even if we know, even if we're sure, we need to just keep a little inkling of what if, because those what ifs may play out. Not everyone will, but many of them will. And so I think that's the lesson for September. And it's an intriguing month because there's a lot of dynamic energy, there's a lot of dynamic change, but I just don't know that it builds into anything that becomes a critical, what do they call that? It's like a nuclear reaction that doesn't quite yet reach critical mass. So that's it. I'll see all of you who are on the patron schedule. I'll see you either with some cosmic interviews, or I will see you for the mid-month update. Also remember, if you are intrigued or interested, there are the cosmic connections that are available through the Astrology Hub. And that's something that there are about 50 or more episodes of that, discussions with me and Amanda Pua Walsh, the founder of Astrology Hub, on a whole variety of things. And other than that, until next month, don't forget to think as cosmically as you possibly can. And yet, the more cosmically you think, the more locally you need to act. Think cosmically, act locally. I'm Rick Levine. See you all soon.